Black Earth offers a full suite of humic solutions, from high-purity granules to powder, liquid, and soluble formulations, all powered by pure humulite. Trusted by growers worldwide from one of the world's rarest humulite reserves. Grow stronger with the power of Black Earth Humulite. Learn more from Mind to Market by visiting blackearth.com.
I'm Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture, and joining me now is Greg Cherewyk. He's president of Pulse Canada. Greg, how are you?
I'm doing well, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
All right. Now, it's been a while since we spoke. Let's start with, because of course there have been some really cool things happening over the past few days that are exciting for the pulse markets. But let's start with maybe a lay of the land. Since we last spoke, have there been any tariffs lifted, any tariffs added when it comes to pulse production into our major markets? Catch us up.
Yeah, okay. So I think we have been talking about India quite often, you and I, and just to kind of get us back to the same page with respect to where we stand, we did have lentil duties reimposed in the spring, and they amounted to about 11% when you add them all up together, which allows Canada to continue to do business with India, so not prohibitive. Just shortly after that, India did re-extend its lifting of restrictions on pea imports all the way through to March 2026. So there's currently zero tariff and zero other assorted restrictions associated with pea imports. And I think when you take the tariff situation and then look at what's happened in the way of business, you'll see that India has been, they've been very much open for business for us. So since 2024, we've shipped over 1.4 or 1.3 billion dollars worth of yellow peas and lentils. So India has been very much open for business for Canada. Um, that's been very important, of course, because as you know, China imposed a 100% duty on Canadian yellow peas in March of this year. So for India to be back in business and to be importing Canadian yellow peas in particular, as well as lentils, has been very important to the Canadian pulse industry. So tariffs have been manageable. They've allowed for trade, and we've done a significant volume into India over the course of the last year.
So it's perhaps not talked about as much because so much focus is on canola. But as you mentioned, China did impose a tariff on Canadian peas as well. Um, let's maybe this is the other way around, but let's start then on the China file, and then I do want to talk about sort of the news on the India side. But how does China fit into this? Because I think when we think pulses, we tend to think India as our market, and as you outlined, it has been very important, and product has been moving. How important is China to Canadian pulse products?
Well, China's been incredibly important for Canadian pulses and yellow peas specifically. So, over the last 5 years, China has been the world's largest importer of yellow peas. It's taken over 10 million tons. And for Canada, over the last 5 years, we've exported $3.7 billion worth of yellow peas to China. That averages over 700 million a year. It was a very significant market for us. Um, the loss of that market has been, it's been really hard on the Canadian pulse industry. Specifically, farmers have seen a price of yellow peas drop 43%, 50% decline in green pea prices since since China imposed the penalties or sorry, the tariffs in March. So it's been incredibly impactful in terms of, returns to farmers. And, when you take India and China combined and just look at yellow peas, that's 81% of our market.
Wow.
So it's an incredibly, China's incredibly important, but it also puts an incredible amount of pressure on,
Mm-hmm.
the Canadian pulse industry to not only move product into India, but to also find diversified and alternative markets for yellow peas in particular.
Now, China is one that, like, obviously in recent memory, it's been very impactful as far as taking a lot of product. Is that a relatively new thing, or has China been a consistent buyer of Canadian peas?
Well, I mean, I like to tell stories. So, I mean, when I first started working on the pulse file, it was 1999.
Mm.
And we worked on a paper that was designed to kind of outline how the Canadian pulse industry could start to make inroads into China. And what we were trying to achieve first was tariff parity with things like corn and soy so that we could, expand the market in China into feed as well. And in those days, we were talking probably between 20 and 50,000 tons of product moving into the market, all moving in containerized. That market developed incrementally and then very quickly over the years to go from that 20, 50,000 ton market to over 2 million tons at its peak. So incredibly important. It is a market that we've developed over the course of 30 years. And I think that's a really important point because you're going to hear quite often from politicians and from government officials that Canada needs to diversify, right? And no one would argue with that. It's been a major priority for our industry and for our organization is to focus on diversification of markets for Canadian pulses. But when you look at the exercise that we've been through in China, you'll understand that it's taken us 25 years to create this market with this amount of demand. There's been a lot of work done by farmers over the years, a lot of work done by the trade over the years to create those opportunities, and it's paid off. So that market is really a market that started by using peas for their starch to make this thing called a vermicelli noodle.
Mm-hmm.
It evolved into a market for not only the starch but for the protein. So they fractionate and create pea protein isolate there. And of course, there's peas going into food products, into feed, both swine as well as pigeon feed, et cetera. So it's been an important and diversified market within for our industry, and it's taken us many years to create that. So when we talk about diversification and talk about looking for new markets, I mean, I want you to keep that in mind. You don't turn on a 2 million ton market overnight.
Mm-hmm.
If those markets existed, they would already be there. So it's going to take time for us to develop them. And that just kind of speaks to the importance of that market for us and getting back to business, to having that 100% tariff removed so that we can, continue to work with our customers there. And on that point, I think it's also important to highlight that, and the Americans know this well, when you're shut out of a market for a period of time because of trade and tariff wars, there's no guarantee that you'll go back and occupy the pole position. You will not necessarily be the preferred supplier again. We used to own that market. We owned over 90% of that market in China. Well, there's new competition. There's peas coming out of Russia, out of Ukraine, out of other countries within that Black Sea region, and even Argentina, believe it or not. And as our customers become accustomed to working with quality from other origins, they will learn how to create a pea protein isolate that their customers prefer as much as they prefer Canadian product. We're not there yet, thankfully. Canadian peas are still recognized as the ingredient in that market, but you have to understand that this will happen.
Right.
If they're forced to accommodate variability and to adjust and to utilize ingredients from other sources, they will figure out how to do it. And then it's going to be very difficult to get back in and again, be the dominant supplier to that market. So time is of the essence, I guess, is our point. It's the point that we've been hammering Ottawa on. We understand these things are complicated. We understand the interplay between Canada and the US and Canada and China. But, what we've heard from this government is good. They're prepared to segment. They're prepared to strategically compartmentalize issues. They're prepared to recognize the importance of economic partnerships and relationships that we've established in the effort to find solutions to these problems. And so, can't happen soon enough for us. We need to get back into China.
So, and there's several different points there that we could probably spend a whole show talking about. One of which is exactly as you pointed out, the length of time it takes to actually develop some of these markets, and develop meaning, it's not just about, oh, you like this ingredient, here it is. But as you pointed out, a pea starch has a home, but pea protein has a home. And I know here we think of protein as maybe the thing that we're after, and the starch is where we need to find a home. Other markets might be completely separate. So it's that learning process from each other, right? So at the same time, a few news stories over this weekend sort of play into both of these markets. And so if we can maybe pause on China for a moment and talk about, so our Anita Anand was in India the 14th, or sorry, yes, I think it wrapped on the 14th, so just a few days ago, talking about these diplomatic relationships between our countries. India and Canada, of course, have been not on the greatest of terms, but we've seen certainly some improvements over the past few months, and seeing an official trip definitely, I think, would rank highly on the improvement of diplomatic relations from the outside anyway. From your perspective, how do you see it? How important is it to be improving diplomatic relations and potentially then trade relations with India?
Yeah, it's very important. I mean, this began with the invitation to Prime Minister Modi to attend the G7 meeting in Kananaskis, and so this is building on that. There have been engagements in between, of course, but to have the Minister of Foreign Affairs travel there to meet with the Prime Minister, to meet with the Minister of External Affairs, Jai Shankar, and then to meet with the Minister of Commerce, Goyal, is incredibly important. The things that you outlined there in terms of the roadmap for Canada-India bilateral relations being kind of announced, and then in the context of this global uncertainty that we're all operating in, recognizing the importance of a strong and resilient Canada-India relationship is important. There were specific mentions to agriculture cooperation, to the importance of reliable supply chains. All of this is speaking directly to the pulse industry because we are the biggest export interest from Canada into India. And then importantly, and kind of more tangible, is the commitment to initiate these ministerial level discussions, which are often a bit of a precursor to more formal negotiations of agreements. So these are all really positive signals from both sides that, Canada and India are working hard to get the relationship back on track, and they're prepared to do some very concrete things in that effort. It's not just words. They've laid out a pathway here to start working more closely together, and that's incredibly important. I was there at the end of September, only a few weeks ago, meeting with the new High Commissioner. So this is also an important step that's happened in the interim. We've reinstated High Commissioners in Ottawa and in Delhi. I met with the new High Commissioner, Chris Cooter, Minister Commercial, Ed Jager, had the opportunity to fully brief them on the Pulse file. So they'd only been there in some cases a week, and they were getting a full briefing on how important that market is for us in the Pulse industry. And I also on the way home had the opportunity to fully brief the Department of Global Affairs, multiple officials throughout the department, so that Minister Anand could be fully briefed in advance of her meetings with the Prime Minister and the Minister of External Affairs and Commerce. So with all that said, we're very comfortable that she went into those meetings on the 13th, 14th, very well prepared and understanding exactly what's a priority for the pulse industry and, what the key messages are.
You've outlined, I think, one of the points that, a lot of us who aren't part of, a producer group or these sorts of organizations, of just how many people sort of you have to read into an issue, right? And how many touch points you kind of have to ensure that, exactly as you outlined, the information that they need as a minister, let's say, to go into that meeting, that she's got the briefing that she needs to really drive home the importance and knows what, she's really working towards for Canadian producers. So really fascinating to know sort of how some of those conversations happen, and that they are happening behind the scenes. We don't always hear about it. So glad to sort of hear about how that kind of works and how important that is. So looking forward then, as you mentioned, it's obviously incredibly important that the relationship with India continues sort of on this roadmap, on this path forward. China, I think, in some ways is a much bigger question. Where do you see as sort of the next signpost from the China-Canada side on trade? Any indication of what we could expect even on conversation? I know there was some talk this past weekend of, if EV tariffs were gone, maybe we could have, tariffs lifted. But that to me just seems too simple. So what do you see as perhaps the next few steps that might happen? or could happen?
Well, we're headed there in the first week of November, along with a number of other Canadian commodity groups that are attending the Canada-China Business Council Business Forum. And we'll be participating in an agri-food trade mission that goes from Beijing to Shanghai to attend the China International Import Expo, which is regarded as China's flagship event. It's an important event for President Xi. And when we say that, it means that these are the attendees are noted. So Canada will be there. We will have a presence. There will be a Canadian pavilion. The Saskatchewan government will be there as well. So, these are the types of things that are important in the context of the milestones that you're looking for in the improvement of a relationship. So, it's one thing to have Prime Minister Carney speak to his counterpart on the margins of a meeting. It's another thing to have, things like the Joint Economic Trade Commission meet at the end of August and reach agreements on what types of working groups need to be established. But ultimately, these are political challenges that will be solved by politicians. And so, we're expecting that Minister Sidhu, the Minister of International Trade, will be there. We'd be very happy to see Minister McDonald present as well. And it's showing up as industry. It's showing up as industry in partnership with government to demonstrate the commitment to the market and the desire to see something resolved quickly. It's difficult, as you noted, to kind of forecast exactly what the right mix of solutions is going to look like. I think, from my perspective, it's been made clear that the tariffs that were put on peas, canola oil, canola meal, pork, and seafood were done in direct retaliation to the tariffs or the surtaxes that were put on EVs, steel, and aluminum. So if we're looking for where Canada is going to have to change its approach, it's there. And China's been very clear. They've been very clear with us as industry and to government, and they've said it publicly, they've said it privately. This is what needs to happen. Should you, change your approach on these surtaxes, you'll see a reciprocal response from China. So that's, of course, what we've been encouraging our government to look at. We're not going to be prescriptive as the pulse industry and try to dictate what we think must happen, because there's probably more than one ways to get at a solution here. But it's clear that we need to be negotiating. And I think, from my perspective, what I'm hearing from Ottawa in the context of India, in the context of China and other relationships is there's a recognition that the world has become more transactional and they're going to have to find ways to make deals. And so, what we've seen so far is good in the sense that people are meeting, the right things are happening. We're moving through the stages in the ways that you'd expect to move through them. But we need to see it happen, on a bit of a more urgent basis. I think there's going to be a tendency to look for, one big solution here, one thing that kind of wraps this whole thing up. And I can understand why you'd want to do that. But at the same time, I think we have to be practical and think about, well, if there are some concessions that Canada is prepared to make, what are the concessions we would look for from China in return? And so we're anxious to hear those responses from our government. What is their game plan? It must be multi-pronged in terms of, how they might approach things and what they might look for in return from certain concessions they might make. So, getting peas on their radar screen and ensuring not at the expense of anything else, but just ensuring that they completely understand the importance of this market from a pulse producer's perspective and from, a pea export program perspective is key because it helps them, appreciate where there might be room to make that deal. So, that's what we've been doing for months, ever since March 8th, since the tariffs were announced. And that's what we'll continue to do when we hit the ground there in November.
All right, Greg, President with Pulse Canada, thank you so much for joining me here on Real Agriculture.
Thanks, Lindsay.